The bride was missing 3 fingers. A one-eyed cook held her hand anyway. The skillet handle was already blistering hot by the time I saw her sitting on the crate outside Haverson's store, and I almost kept walking. The stage had come through an hour before, couple of passengers, a trunk that nobody claimed, and her. She had a carpetbag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and she was watching the street like she expected someone to come around the corner still. Nobody was coming. I'd been in enough places long enough to know that look. I set the skillet down on the step and told Paco to mind the fire. She had brown hair going toward red in the sun, and a dress that was prairie clean, washed but travel-creased, the kind of clean that takes effort on the road. When she looked up, I saw she wasn't as young as I'd thought from a distance, which made it worse somehow. There were some miles behind those eyes already. I said, "You waiting on somebody?" She said, "I was supposed to be." I said, "Was?" She said the name, Dillard Keech. I knew Dillard Keech. Everybody on the Pratt Range knew Dillard Keech, and what they knew was that he'd ridden out 6 weeks back with a Salam's outfit toward the Staked Plains, and nobody'd heard from them since. I didn't tell her that right away. I pulled a crate up and sat down across from her at a remove that was respectful. She had her hands folded in a way that I noticed but didn't remark on. The left one was missing the ring finger and the middle finger both. The skin over the stumps healed smooth and old. The kind of old that says, years ago, not yesterday. I said, "You came from where?" "St. Joseph," she paused. "By way of a stop I won't go back to." I said that was fine. I didn't ask about the stop. Her name was Clara Moss, or it had been until a month before when she'd signed the papers to become Clara Keech. That's how she said it, until a month before, like a door she'd walked through that had closed behind her. "My name is August Rill, and I have been cooking for outfits since I was 19 years old. I lost the eye to a branding iron in a fire when I was 26, which was a long time ago now, and the patch is leather, and the leather is dark from years of smoke and grease, and I don't think about it anymore. Men on an outfit don't think about it either after the first week. You get useful fast enough, and people stop seeing the things that aren't there. I've been cooking for Pratt 3 seasons. It was decent work. Del Pratt was a hard man, but he paid on time and he didn't shortchange the chuck. And when a man doesn't shortchange the chuck, I can do my job. I had a cook wagon and a mule named Ruth and a cast-iron Dutch oven that I'd carried since Abilene, and that was about all I required. What I didn't have was anything resembling a life outside the distance, between the fire and the tailgate. I'm not saying that with any self-pity. I'm just saying it was true. The cook at Haverson's was a Mexican boy named Paco who had no business cooking, and I'd been sent in to pick up lard and coffee and some dried beans before we moved camp. I had no intention of sitting on a crate outside a general store talking to a woman who'd been stood up by a dead man. And yet, I went back inside and talked to Haverson. He confirmed what I already guessed. Keech was gone. The Lam outfit had run into Comanche trouble up by the Canadian, and that was the last reliable word. He said there'd been a letter sent to her, but letters to St. Joseph took time. I went back outside. She was still sitting there. She hadn't moved except to open the carpetbag and look at something inside it. She closed it before I got there. She said, "He's dead, isn't he?" I said, "That's the word going around." She nodded. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and looked down the street again. Then she looked at her hands in her lap. She said, "I have $4 and some change." I said, "Okay." She said, "The stage back to St. Joseph is $1.70. I said I didn't know what the fare was. She said, "I'm not going back." I said, "Okay." We sat there a minute. The sun was getting into late afternoon, and the dust was that particular orange color it goes out here before dark. I said, "Can you work?" She looked up. I said, "I don't mean anything improper. I mean work. There's work to be done on a cattle outfit, and I'm one man doing it. I can't pay wages because I don't have wages to give, but there's a place on the wagon and there's food." She said, "What kind of work?" I said, "Biscuits if you can make them. Mending. Whatever needs doing, I'll show you." She sat with that. I said, "I'm not asking for anything else." She looked at me a long time. The one eye I've got, it doesn't always put people at ease, but she looked at it the same as she looked at the other. She was deciding something, and she wasn't hurrying. She said, "Your name?" I said, "August Rill." She said, Mr. Rill. I said, August is fine. She said, August, I need you to understand something before I say yes to anything. I've had enough of men who help and then expect. I said I understood. She said, I need to hear you say you understand what I mean. I said, I'm offering work in a seat on a wagon. That's the whole of it. She picked up the carpet bag. She said, then I'll make your biscuits. We moved camp 3 days later, north and east toward the summer graze, and she was on the wagon seat beside me with her bag under the bench and Ruth pulling steady in the traces. Paco was riding behind on his horse, and I heard him tell one of the hands that the cook had a woman, and the hand said something back, and Paco said no, not like that. I never found out what the hand said to that. She learned the camp fast, faster than I'd expected. She'd done real work somewhere in her life, and it showed, the way she handled the Dutch oven, the way she got a fire started with damp wood, the economy of her movements around a small space. She didn't talk much while she worked, but she wasn't unfriendly. She was just efficient. I appreciated that. The biscuits were better than mine. I told her so. She said my mother made them. She rolled the dough thinner than you'd think. I said I'd like to learn that. She looked at me sideways, and then she showed me. She used the heel of her right hand mostly, and she kept her left tucked close to her side, guiding more than pressing, and I didn't say anything about that, and she didn't explain it. At night she slept in the wagon, and I slept underneath it, which was where I'd always slept, and that was a decent arrangement, and nobody spoke on it. The first week was quiet. The second week Del Pratt rode by the cook wagon mid-morning, which he didn't usually do, and he looked at her and looked at me, and I looked back at him and waited. He said, who's this? I said, Clara, she's helping with the chuck. He said, I don't recall hiring any help. I said, I'm not billing you for her, she works for her keep. He said, that right, and he looked at her in the way that some men do, taking stock, assessing. She was cutting salt pork at the tailgate, and she kept cutting, and she didn't look up. Pratt said to me, that going to cause trouble? I said, I haven't given you trouble in 3 seasons, Del. He chewed on that. He looked at her one more time, and she still didn't look up, and he rode on. That was the end of it, more or less. There were looks and there was talk, the way there always is, and she bore it without comment, and I didn't make speeches about it because speeches draw more attention than silence. What I did do was position the cook wagon at the edge of camp, near the rope corral where Ruth was staked, so there was some distance and some noise between her and the main fire at night. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it for 2 days, and then one evening she said, thank you for where you put the wagon. I said it was a good spot for the mule. She said, August. I said, it's a good spot for the mule and it's convenient. She handed me a cup of coffee, and she let it go. I want to say something about the hand, because I've been going around it and I shouldn't. I saw men look at it. Some were subtle about it, and some weren't. One of the younger hands, Eames, said something to her one afternoon that I didn't hear full, but I heard the tone, and she went still in the way she went still when she was deciding whether to answer. I came around the side of the wagon and I said, Eames, you're on the south picket tonight. He said, that ain't my rotation. I said, it is now. He looked at me, I looked back at him. I've been doing this a long time, and Eames was maybe 22. And there's a thing that happens when a man who's been doing something a long time looks at a man who hasn't. Eames went. She said, I can handle my own trouble. I said, I know you can, but you don't have to. She looked at me for a moment. I said, I'm not doing it because I think you can't. I'm doing it because you're on my crew. She looked back at the pots. The thing about the hand, she told me about it herself later when she was ready. I didn't ask. We were maybe 2 weeks out when she told me. It had been a husband, her first one, before she'd managed to get clear. A door hinge, deliberately. I'm not going to say more than that because it's not mine to say more than that. What I'll say is that, after she told me, I went and checked the mule's water, and I stood there for about 5 minutes in the dark before I could trust my face to look normal again. When I came back, she was washing the tin plates, and she said, I didn't tell you so you'd be angry. I said I wasn't angry. She said, you're angry. I said, a little. She said, okay, a little is all right. What started happening around the 3rd week was that the men started coming to me with things. Small things. Alvarez's bridle needed a repair, and he asked if I had a spare length of leather. Odom's boot had a seam splitting, and he asked Clara did she have thread stout enough. Pratt needed to know if we had enough coffee to last to the Cimarron crossing, and he asked me instead of sending one of the boys. I noticed it, but I didn't think on it too hard. What I think now is that a cook wagon with 2 people running it competently is a different thing than a cook wagon with 1. There was something settled about it, something that said, here is the center of the camp and it's working. Clara noticed it before I did. She said one night after the men had gone to their beds, they come to you different now. I said, how do you mean? She said, like you're somebody, like they've decided. I said I hadn't done anything different. She said, no, but it looks different. I said, what does? She said, you. She was looking at the fire when she said it. When there's 2 of you doing it right, it looks like something on purpose. They can see the purpose. I didn't have a good answer for that. I poured the last of the coffee into my cup and I held it. She said, that doesn't bother you. I said, no. She said, some men don't like being seen that way. I said, what way? She said, as part of something, as though they needed it to look like what it is. I said, I've been on my own a long time. I don't have any pride about being part of something. She looked at me then from across the fire, and she didn't say anything else, and neither did I. A month out, we were camped along a dry creek bed south of the Cimarron when the weather came. It came fast, the way it does out here, a bruise on the northwest sky that becomes a wall in about the time it takes you to notice it. And I got the wagon tongue swung around and the canvas lashed down and the mule staked short before the first real gust hit. She was handing me pegs and line without me asking for them. We worked through the whole thing without speaking. Rain sideways, lightning every few minutes, and the 2 of us getting the camp as tight as it could get. I sent the men to their bedrolls and Pratt to his tent, and the horses were already hobbled. When it broke, we were both soaked through. She wrung out her hair and I took my hat off and the water came off it in a sheet. She said, you put the mule on the leeward side. I said, she doesn't like the lightning. She said, I know, I saw you do it. We were standing at the back of the wagon in the dark after the rain, and she looked at me in the way that she had started to look at me sometimes, which I had started to notice, but had not let myself think too much about. She said, August, what is it you want? I said, right now I want dry boots. She said, that's not what I mean and you know it. I said, I know. She waited. I said, I'm not a young man, Clara. I'm 53 years old and I've got one eye and I've been cooking for outfits for 30 years and I don't own a square foot of ground. I'm not what a woman generally wants when she's thinking about what she wants. She said, I didn't ask you what you think a woman generally wants. I said I understood that. She said, what do you want? I said, I don't let myself think about it too direct. She said, think about it direct. I looked at her. She was standing in the dark after a storm, her hair wet and her dress wet and her left hand at her side, and she was looking back at me without flinching. I said, I'd like it if you stayed on. She said, with the outfit. I said, with me. That landed between us, and neither of us moved for a moment. She said, I'm not going to be something you took in. I said, I know. She said, if I stay, it's because I choose to stay. I said, that's the only way I'd want it. She was quiet a moment. Then she reached out and took hold of my right hand where it was hanging at my side. The grip she used was firm, not clinging. She held my hand the way you hold something you've decided to keep. Her left hand, the one with the missing fingers, she put against the side of my arm, the way a person does when they're steadying themselves on something solid. She said, I'll think on it. I said, that's fair. She let go and went inside the wagon. I stood there a while in the dark with the creek running behind me and a few last drops coming off the canvas, and I didn't feel 53. I didn't feel anything in particular except that the night had gotten very still after the storm, and the stars were starting to come back. She did think on it. She took 2 days with it. 2 days during which she was exactly the same as she'd always been: biscuits in the morning, beans on at noon, supper before dark. And I didn't press her and didn't look at her any differently and tried not to conduct myself in any way that resembled a man waiting, even though I was. Pratt's segundo, a man named Coulter who'd been on the outfit 8 years, said to me on the second morning, quiet and without making much of it, "That's a good woman you've got over there." I said I wouldn't argue. He said outfit runs better. I said I supposed. He said she's staying on. I said I didn't know yet. He said and he rode off. The second evening after the storm, she came around the wagon to where I was greasing the front axle, and she stood there a moment. I kept greasing the axle. She said, if I stay, I want it to be right. I said, so do I. She said, I mean right, not convenient. I said, I mean right too. She said, there's a preacher in Caldwell, a real one, not a circuit rider. I sat back on my heels and looked up at her. She said, we'd have to go back, or wait until the drive ends. I said, we'll go back. She said, Del Pratt won't like it. I said, Del Pratt can say what he likes. Something in her face shifted, just a small thing around the eyes. She looked at me holding the greased tin in the dirt, and she put her hand on the side of my face, the right hand with all its fingers, and she held it there for a moment. She said, okay, August. I said, okay. We went back to Caldwell when the drive ended in September. Del Pratt didn't like it. He said so. I said what I'd say, and he took it the way I expected he would, which was with a lot of noise and not much to back it up. Coulter told me later that Pratt had told the hands that Rill was the best cook he'd had in 20 years, and he was keeping him whether he liked the arrangements or not, and I let that sit without commenting. The preacher in Caldwell was a thin man named Aldous with a long face and honest eyes, and he didn't say anything about her hand, and he didn't say anything about my eye, and he married us in a room off the back of the church with Coulter and his wife as the witnesses. She wore the dress she'd arrived in, which she'd washed in the creek the day before. I wore my second shirt. Her hand, when I held it, she put her left hand in mine, the one with the missing fingers was steady. The stumps of the two lost fingers lay against my palm, and I held the whole of it, and she looked at me, and I looked back at her. Aldous said the words. I said what I was supposed to say, and so did she. After outside, Coulter shook my hand, and his wife embraced Clara, and the afternoon was cool, and the sky was that particular blue it gets in Kansas in September, which is different from any other blue. Clara stood beside me while Coulter's wife was talking to her, and she wasn't looking at anyone. She was looking out at the street, and I watched her without trying to be obvious about it. She had the look of a woman who has finally stopped watching the corner for somebody who isn't coming. We went back to the Pratt outfit that winter and the next. The cook wagon was still mine, and Ruth was still hauling it, and now there were two of us running the camp. The third season Pratt gave me a small raise that he called a supply budget increase, and everybody knew what it was, and nobody said so out loud. What I know is this: I'm not a man who has accumulated much. No land, no cattle, no great sum of anything. I've got the Dutch oven and the mule and a patch over one eye and a wife who chose to stay. Some men need a lot of things to feel like they have something. I've found I don't. There's a moment every morning before the camp is up when I'm at the fire alone and the light is just starting to change. The coffee's on and the Dutch oven is heating, and in a little while she'll come out of the wagon and there will be 2 cups instead of 1. She takes her coffee with a little of the condensed milk when we have it, and not when we don't. I hand her the cup. She takes it with both hands, the way she does, and she wraps her fingers around it, all the fingers she has left, and she stands beside me at the fire. That's enough. That's about all a man could ask for. The camp doesn't stir for another half hour, and the whole morning is ours.